Hello and welcome back, everybody, to Decision Desk HQ's Let Me Finish. I'm Brandon Finnegan, co-founder of Decision Desk. Joining me today is Kirk Beto from Hotline National Journal. And we're going to dive right into the polls because that's what everyone's going to be talking about right now. There has been a slew of them released in the last 24 hours. Emerson, of course, released a giant pile of polling earlier today, around 6 a.m. this morning, basically showing it a toss-up race between Harris and Trump, everyone within 2 points of each other in every single state. In addition to all the polls that were released from Emerson, the New York Times released several key Senate polls in the states of Montana and the state of Florida. And the polls from Quinnipiac yesterday that showed Donald Trump losing Pennsylvania by 3, but up over Harris now in both Wisconsin and Michigan. Just a slew of polling data that's been released. And the general theme of it is things still look nationally slightly favoring Harris in terms of the popular vote, but the states are all incredibly tight, maybe slightly tighter for Harris in states she's been enjoying the leads in. And the Senate's a very different picture. Right, the Senate has not looked pretty for the Democrats all this cycle, but particularly with the latest round of polling we've seen out of Montana, out of Ohio, where we've seen Sherrod Brown at best with a poll of +4 from the New York Times, but more recently several surveys showing him +1 or +2 from the Washington Post or from Marist. So I'd love to see what your thoughts are on this, Kirk. Is this just gravity finally catching up with the Democrats in the purple states?
That's exactly what this is right now. It was always kind of an aberration that the vulnerable Democratic incumbents, especially in those presidential swing states, were leading their GOP opponents by sometimes double digits earlier this summer. But that was before the money came in. That was before this ad campaign came in, and before a lot of people started really tuning in to these down ballot races. But now that we're here, 26 some odd days out, there's been a slew of ads going negative against these Democratic incumbents. The name ID of their Republican opponents has increased as well. And now what we're seeing here is kind of like the great confluence as the presidential polls in those states are starting to look a lot more like the Senate polls as well. Things are getting really, really tight here in the final 4 weeks. I wanted to ask you here about the national polls here real quick, because we wrote about all these polls this morning in Hotline, and I think our subject line today was, news flash, the race is tight. I feel like we're on kind of like the dog bites man portion of polling right now, where it's same old here. If there is any poll that shows anything outside of about a margin of error race in these swing states, that's cause for news. But Brandon, this better than anybody here that that's going to be an outlier. I mean, it just seems like poll after poll after poll, the race is tight. As of today, we're recording this on Thursday. There's not going to be another CNN debate. It doesn't seem like there's going to be another debate. It doesn't seem like there's going to be any big event that the candidates can control to shift things either way.
Yeah, I think that a lot of things are just locked in at this point. So it really comes down to if this is a low turnout election, right? It appears that Harris will win that kind of election. The only way that Trump's going to finish this off and win these states is if he's able to turn out these lower, less inclined voters, the voters who didn't show up in the midterms in 2022, but like Donald Trump. Now, there's evidence in the polling we've seen, at least so far, that there's a chunk of these voters that exist. They seem to be motivated and excited enough to turn out potentially. Cook Political Report released a survey which found that amongst regular voters, Harris has an edge in swing states, but if you then factor in the voters that are not regular voters that Trump would need to turn out and get motivated to vote, he actually can win those voters comfortably. So if that's the electorate that shows up, if it's a higher turnout race, it probably favors Donald Trump at this point. But again, things are so tight based on at least the polling that we're seeing, it could really break in either direction. And a nominal polling error right now, we're looking at polling averages, but what we're looking at could lead to either a 300 plus electoral college victory for Harris or a 300 plus electoral college victory for Trump. It's all within that margin right now.
It is.
I think what's changed, though, is that the baseline numbers for the Republican candidates in these Senate races, we've seen the Democratic number stay pretty much the same all year. 48%, 49% of the polling. That was going to be where they were going to land. And that's good for a long stretch of time. But if you're not budging at all and then the opposing party starts to climb, if you're in a state that's already very red, like in the case of Montana, that's what happened with Tester. Tester led Sheehy until finally the vote consolidated on the Republican side, and now suddenly Sheehy's comfortably ahead in almost every poll that gets released out of Montana now.
Mm-hmm.
And not by like 1 or 2 points. The latest poll from the New York Times has him up by 8 at 52% of the vote already in Montana.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the difficult task for a lot of Democrats. Sherrod Brown has been very lucky. 2006 was a great year for him. 2012 was a good presidential year. 2018 was a good Democratic midterm. Now it's 2024 in a presidential year. Donald Trump's going to win Ohio, and he's going to win Ohio comfortably.
Mm-hmm.
How far ahead he can race from that, it's probably a couple of points. Well, if Donald's up by 6 or 7 points, that puts Sherrod Brown right there in the crosshairs. And frankly, if Donald wins by larger than that, if he gets close to 10-point win in Ohio, which is very possible, then Sherrod Brown's not going to be able to outrun it.
Yeah, if Trump is winning Ohio by double digits, I don't think Brown has enough juice for that. But if it's in that like 7-8 range, then that's a jump ball, and I'm going to have to give the advantage to Brown there. Brandon, you mentioned those New York Times polls. There's a reason why the Times polled Montana, Florida, and Texas, because those are the races that are basically going to decide this whole thing. Because Montana, with West Virginia off the board with Joe Manchin retiring, that's a Republican flip already. So we're basically at a 50-50 Senate right now. Montana, a state that Trump won by about 16 points in 2020, is next on that list of the most vulnerable Democratic members. Now, Democrats cannot afford to lose any seat at all, or else the Republicans are going to get the majority outright here. And again, the New York Times poll confirmed what previous public polling has seen. Jon Tester is losing to Republican Tim Sheehy. Now, Florida and Texas are probably Democrats' best offensive pickup opportunities, but the poll today in the New York Times showed both of those races with Republicans with comfortable leads in both of those. Now, the Democrats have made a big deal the last 2 weeks of that we're going to play in there. We're going to start investing some money in there. Look, if they wanted a fallback plan, they should have started investing in there in the summer. I don't know what a few, hybrid ad buys are going to do for Colin Allred down in Texas now, or Debbie McCurcio-Powell down in Florida, when Rick Scott, basically who's the wealthiest senator in history, can write himself a check with more commas and zeros than you and I have probably ever seen in our lives to get that seat in his favor. I mean, Democrats are really just, up a creek without a paddle right now in terms of the Senate races.
And you look at the presidential races and what their margins are. We saw the New York Times had a pretty eye-popping margin in Florida for Donald Trump. But even in Texas, like we saw the Marist poll that was released at midnight, 7-point lead for Donald Trump, actually slightly better than he got in 2020. So he's holding his own or doing better. The only way the Democrats can flip Texas in the Senate is if Donald Trump is performing so poorly, he's vastly underperforming what he did 4 years ago, which then makes the Republicans underneath vulnerable, or they find some unique vulnerability for Ted Cruz. Now, Ted Cruz isn't exactly the most popular senator, but he's popular enough, and it's enough in a state that's as red as Texas is. Right. So these are Hail Mary efforts by the Democrats. They think that they have one more card up their sleeve, which is what's going on in Nebraska, where they have an independent candidate that's running, But the problem with that is we've seen this story before in neighboring Kansas. I remember the race in 2014 where Pat Roberts was very vulnerable and trailing his independent opponent until Republicans made the connection of, yeah, this independent's going to caucus the Democrats, so you're voting for a Democrat. Right. And if the option is a Republican or a Democrat statewide in Nebraska, that ultimately does not become any sort of a favorable race for the Democratic Party. So their best chance at controlling the Senate right now is basically one of the races they just started throwing money into with no organization compared to what they've had in other states, which is a really big ask to do in Florida or Texas, or pulling that trick of he's an independent, vote for the independent, which just isn't going to last once the Republican barrage of ads come in and say, yeah, he's going to run with the Democrats.
And those are coming in. Republicans are getting a little bit nervous about Nebraska. You saw Deb Fischer start going negative against Dan Osborne in her paid ads. The NRSC starting to make major investments in that as well. They're not leaving that to chance right now. That is not a sleeper race when it's getting millions of dollars of outside spending coming in. It's going to be the Republicans are going to make sure that stays in their column
to close it up. And of course, then you've got my state of Maryland, which has the Senate race there with our former governor running in that. But
Maryland's breaking against Republicans pretty strongly right now in recent polling as well.
And that's not gonna go too well for them there. But it's looking like overall the Republicans are heading towards a 52 seat majority in the U.S. Senate right now. If everything kind of was held together, and I don't particularly like Sherrod Brown's odds right now, I would say the Republicans are looking at about 52 seats in the Senate, maybe more. We've seen weakness also with Bob Casey, with Tammy Baldwin, the open seat in Michigan. These are all potential seats. If for some reason polling does have an error and it breaks red this time, the final results break red, it's completely conceivable that one or two or even all three seats end up falling into Republican hands.
It is hard for me to believe, though, that in those presidential battlegrounds we're talking about outside of the Montana, Ohio of the world, that they would go an opposite way of how the presidency goes. I don't think that necessarily. Maybe Bob Casey has enough ability to create his own weather that even if Harris loses Pennsylvania, he could still beat Dave McCormick. But I don't think Baldwin or Alyssa Slotkin, who's running for that open seat in Michigan, has enough of the. Again, this is a numbers show here, so please excuse me for saying has the juice to get across the line if Harris ends up losing those states.
Well, I think we can kind of wrap things here. Just this recap on everything right now. We finally have a pile of Senate polls that are at least somewhat dynamic, where we get a bigger picture of the whole country. And we're going to, I'm sure, see more of that. And the remaining we have 3 weeks and a few days to go until presidential election 2024. I want to remind everybody that if you want to get all the latest analysis and news about election 2024, you can go to DecisionDeskHQ.com. We, of course, will be providing live election night returns on Decision Desk HQ with all the context and calls you're looking for, the end point of this long campaign. For Kirk Beto of National Review Hotline, myself, Decision Desk HQ, I want to thank you all for watching again, and check us again next time.